So the myth and magic of the drowner. That's the title of my talk, because the drowner was the foreman of the water meadows. We all think of the river valleys of Hampshire and Wessex, and that's where I'm mainly concentrating on, Hampshire and Wessex, as peaceful areas that we walk down, and there's the long distance footpaths of the River Itchen and the Avon and the Meon and things like that. But actually, 100 years ago, they were hive activity, and the guy who managed the water meadow and got everybody to do what they needed to do when they needed to do it was called the drowner. And why it's the myth and magic of the drowner is historically that they were farm workers, and they didn't really write down what they were doing. They didn't understand the technology of what they were doing. They just knew it worked. It's counterintuitive that you irrigate grassland in the winter and it makes the grass grow. Because normally you would expect, if you put water on grass, the water would go anaerobic and stagnate and the grass would die. So this technology that allowed the grass to grow in the winter was absolutely amazing, because between 1600 and about 1900, we're in a little ice age and the winters were much, much colder. So who am I? I've been working in the river valleys of Hampshire and Wessex since the 1980s. And I've basically walked the rivers, most of the rivers, the Itchen, not so much the Test, but certainly the Itchen, the Avon, the Meon, and north of Salisbury, almost from source to sea. So I was seeing these meadows, seeing this technology. And in the late 1980s, the government was looking to introduce conservation. And I was asked by the ecologists, because I'm a hydrologist, to go out and help them decide where they would put bunds and sluices and scrapes in the river valleys, with the aim of keeping the land wet into the spring for breeding waders, the birds, but also insects and all the other wonderful animals that live on the water meadows, the otters and the waterfowl. And I started going out into the river valleys, and all of a sudden I saw these structures, and I said, you don't need to put extra bunds in. There's a system here. What is it? And the farmer said, oh, well, it's the water meadows. It's the sheep corn system. And I hadn't a clue what they were talking about. So that was my introduction to water meadows. And I started looking, and I started talking to farmers and finding out what was going on. So what is a water meadow? This is an aerial photograph of the Meon Valley, just upstream of Titchfield Haven. And you can see that the river goes kind of across the middle of that picture. And you can see to the top of that picture, there's all kinds of wriggly lines. And those are the natural watercourses the other side of the valley. But towards the lower side of the valley, they're all regular lines. There's straight lines on those fields. And you can see that there's a row of trees, and they are actually the line of the Titchfield Canal. And the Titchfield Canal is actually higher, quite as significantly higher, several meters than the river. So all along the Titchfield Canal, there are sluices which allow the water to run over those fields. And the idea was the fields are actually ridge and furrow. And you would take the water along a high-level carrier, like the Titchfield Canal. You would actually have a shallow channel along the top of the ridge. The water would slowly trickle down the side of the ridge, and then there would be drains that would take it to the river. So you could actually surface irrigate the whole of that field. And that's what they were doing. They were doing it all year round, but they were doing it mainly in the winter. When did they begin? We really don't know when they began. There are references to them for monasteries. And this is actually Waverley Abbey, just south of Guildford on the River Wey. And all round Waverley Abbey and the River Wey, there's water meadows. And there are one or two references in Yorkshire to water meadows in the old Abbey rolls. And I don't know if you know about the Winchester pipe rolls. The Winchester pipe rolls are, if you like, the accounts of the bishopric of Winchester from about 1200 to about 1700, and they're almost complete. And this is where we find elusive references to water meadows, but they don't talk about the water meadows as we know them. These are accounts, and they're mainly talking about buying stuff. So they might say that they've cut a whole load of timber down, and that timber is going to be used for a sluice in the river valley. And that's all they'll say about the water meadow. Or there might be some fines or something like that. They're also written in medieval Latin, and I don't read medieval Latin. So I haven't really been through these with a fine-tooth comb. They are slowly translating them into modern day English. But again, they're really difficult reading. And I have looked at one of the translations for one of the year, and there are references that could be water meadows, but we're not sure. There are odd references, but they talk about wet meads, and we're never sure whether they're just talking about summer grazing lands or whether they're talking about irrigated water meadows, as I'm going to explain today. So when I walked into St Cross is just south of Winchester, and I took this picture. I thought I'd found the missing links between the water meadows and St Cross, because this is a very old foundation, 1135, and the water channeled there is very, very efficient, shall we say. So the water comes from the River Itchen, it goes behind those buildings where the kitchen is, so they could take the water out of this channel for their cooking. It then goes behind the low buildings and under the latrines, so it would take the waste away. And in the foreground, there's probably a 1800 water meadow sluice. And I thought, this is it. This is the link between the monasteries and the water meadows. But actually, we have no evidence that those water meadow sluices were there, whatever form, back before about 1700. So it's really difficult to pin these things down. Throughout the river valleys in Hampshire and Wiltshire and Dorset, water meadows are in the areas of the old monastic lands, but as I say, we haven't really got many links actually pinned them down that said they were operating at the same time as the monasteries. One of the very first references we have is a surveying book by a gentleman called Fitzherbert, written in 1535, and he says that a manner of mending the meadows is if there's any running water or flooded land that may be sat or brought to run over the meadows from the time that they are mown until the beginning of May, and they will be much better. It shall kill and drown and drive away the mouldywarps. Mouldywarps are moles, and fill up the low places with land and make ground even and good to mow. All manner of water is good, so that they not stand still on the ground, but specifically water that comes from the town and every man's midden. So basically, he's saying that they're irrigating these meadows in the early spring. They're using water that comes from the town or the farmyard, so it's got all the waste from the town in it. And so they're using it as a liquid fertilizer system. There's a place on the River Avon where the channel goes through the farmyard and then goes out onto the water meadow, and they would sweep all the waste from the farmyard into the water, and then it would go and fertilize the water meadows. And here they're talking about for a hay crop. They're using this as a really intensive system. And then there's a gentleman called Roland Vaughan. He was up in Herefordshire in the Golden Valley. Now, he actually wrote a whole book about water meadows, which was published in 1610, and he claims he invented water meadows. He had land that had several mills on it, and the mill leats, of course, are at a higher level. And he said he was walking along the mill leat and he got very cross because a mole had dug a hole through the bank of the mill leat. So the water from his mill leat was running out over the field and not going to his mill. And he thought he was losing production in the mill. But then he looked at the land round and he saw that where this water flowed out over the ground, the grass was greener and growing better than in other places. So although he was cross with this mole who had dug a hole in the bank of his mill leat, he was actually quite pleased with it because it gave him the idea that it says, this was the first cause I undertook of the drowning of the ground. Now, he didn't invent water meadows. There were probably some form of water meadows there before he took over this manor in Herefordshire, but he writes a whole book about it, explaining what he's doing and why he's doing it. Another way we know about some of these water meadows is that there are irrigation deeds. So water is always a bone of contention. We have the Environment Agency who regulate it now, but it was the millers who regulated it back then. And the millers owned the water. So there were two farmers near St. Cross in the Itchen Valley, and they had to pay the miller 10 shillings each year for the use of the water. This was back in 1658. And the irrigation deed there, it delineates when they can have the water. So they both wanted the water at the same time. One of them could have the water. So some of the days of the week, the other could have the water. The other days of the week, it also says who's got to mend the hatches and the bridges over the streams. So that was quite an important document when I found it. And if anybody knows of any more, please do let me know. They're quite interesting, are these old documents. In 1668, there was a guy called John Woolridge. Now, he lived at Petersfield on the River Rother, and he wrote this book about agriculture. That's the frontispiece to this book. And if you look at that picture, he's describing or drawing the ideal farm. So at the top, you have a windmill, and then you have a farmer with the shepherd with the sheep up on the downs. You've got a hay cart, I think, in one of the fields, and also someone ploughing. But just under that gentleman who's ploughing, on the kind of top left-hand corner, there's a field with wriggly lines in it. And that's a water meadow. And we think that is the first picture of a water meadow. So that was 1610. And he's describing water meadows on the River Wey, on the Sussex-Hampshire border. And he's extolling their virtues as well as good agricultural practice of the time. So how do these water meadows work? If you go on the Hampshire County Council website and look at water meadows, you'll see this picture. So the river is coming in from the top right-hand corner, and it's divided, and you can see there's lots of sluices across that river. So the top channel that comes across the picture, there's a sluice there, and they can move the water down where it says sloping meadow, and the water runs evenly across that channel, and then you can see it says drain or furrow channel to catch and remove the irrigation runoff. So the water's moving down the sloping meadow into a drain, and then it joins the rivers further down. And that's what I call a catchwork meadow. But if you look in the middle of the picture, it's ridge and furrow. And they're moving the water along the top of the ridge, and there's various stops to divide it into sections. And then the water will run down the side of the ridge into the furrow, and again, away to the river. This is actually a schematic of the River Wey near Passfield. And this is what they were doing there. And you can also see there's an aqueduct there, which is taking water down to a meadow further downstream, because they need a gravity feed on it. So there's lots of high-level carriers throughout the Wey Valley, in the Avon Valley, the Itchen Valley, and also some in the Test Valley. And this is what it looks like. That is a water meadow being irrigated. So on the left-hand side of the field, you can kind of see that there's a channel there. You can kind of see a shallow gradient down to where the water is, and then the water is flowing away. So that's the ridge and furrow system. That's near Salisbury. And the water is actually flowing through that grass. So the idea is not to flood the meadow, but the water to trickle through the grass, and the grass will continue growing. So they're trickling it through the grass no more than 2 inches depth, and that grass is probably about 6 inches high. That picture was probably taken in February, and the grass is growing really well. And the point about the flowing water is if you have flowing water, then it stops the ground from freezing. And back in the 16, 17 and 1800s, winters were much, much colder. So if you could stop the ground from freezing, your grass would continue growing, but you didn't want to flood it. And also the moving water has oxygen in it. So the grass can continue growing through the water because that water is oxygenated, actually just going through the grass keeps it turbulent, which actually puts more oxygen into the water so the grass can grow. So that's at Britford, just south of Salisbury. This is another picture. I think it was taken by my friend Hadrian Cook. It's down in Somerset. That's a catchwork meadow along the side of a hill. So you can see there's kind of channels across, and the water would flow down the side of the hill to the next channel and then flow on down to the river in the bottom. And at the bottom, there's a kind of plough that they use to make these channels. That is not what you want a water meadow to look like. This is on the River Wey. It was a water meadow that I was trying to help restore with the farmer. And we went down, it was December, one day in December, and we saw that. And we were gutted. And we thought, oh no, you know, everything that we wanted to do with this meadow, it'll be ruined. But the next day, just 24 hours later, it looked like that. The point about a water meadow is you've got to be able to drain it. Drainage is much more important on a water meadow than the irrigation, because if you can't get that water off, the water will go stagnant and the grass will die. And there's an old saying that the water has to go on at a trot and off at a gallop. So that's an old Wiltshire saying, and I'll just show you that again. These are pictures taken almost from the same spot, 24 hours apart. So they were controlling the flooding. You can get the water off, even if it floods. And this is on the River Wey, which is quite spatey. We come on to about 1770, and there's a gentleman called George Boswell who lives in Puddletown on the River Piddle. And he writes several pamphlets on water meadows. By 1700, we've got the beginning of the Royal Agricultural Society and the Agricultural Revolution, and they are interested in water and managing land and improving productivity. And George Boswell writes this quite detailed leaflet on how you make a water meadow and how you manage a water meadow. There's one of his books. You can see there's lots of different designs of water meadows. It can be either very straight, or it can be all kinds of different shapes, with the channels going off and the channels coming on for the water and the drains going off. It depends on the topography of the land. It also depends on the soils that you've got as to what kind of layout will be best for your particular piece of land. And he says that the advantages of water meadows are the water manures the land. So I've explained about taking the drainage from the towns and the farmyards and putting it into the water, liquid manure the land. There was a tale in the Itchen Valley that water meadows didn't work south of Winchester because all the goodness had been taken out of the water. So they tried to make water meadows and they didn't really work. Actually, they then put in the Itchen navigation. I think it was about 1660s. And water meadows all kind of started to work, and they could manage them. And they were putting the night soil from Winchester into the Itchen navigation. The water from the Itchen navigation was then going out onto the water meadows. And they said, you know, that was great. And I actually don't think it was anything it was partly to do with the night soil from Winchester, but I didn't think there was enough gradient on the land south of Winchester for the water to flow away properly to the River Itchen. So it wasn't until they got a high level carrier that they had that gradient across the meadows. I have quite a discussion with the parish council people at Twyford who have a water meadow that you can go and walk over, and about the beginnings of the water meadows, whether they were there before the Itchen navigation or after. I think they were after, but we still have brisk discussions about that, shall we say. Chris there goes into the archives and is looking at all the old documents, trying to work out what they're saying. It's not only the manure from the land, from the farmyard and from the towns, but it's also, these are chalk streams. So if the land is acidic, then it also limes the land, which helps the grass grow. So the second point Boswell talks about is the consistency and predictability of grass growth in dry summers. So if you have a dry summer, you can use the irrigation. And although you might be irrigating for perhaps 2 weeks in the winter, by the time you get to the summer, you're probably only irrigating for a day to freshen up the land, to help the grass grow for the hay crop. And there are texts that say they get 2 cuts of hay off this land. Some say you get 3 cuts of hay off the land. He talks about the increased stocking rate on the farm. So this is the day before lots of cattle feed or sheep feed, and in the autumn you had to slaughter most of your animals. You only kept your breeding animals through the winter because you had to feed them. If you have a water meadow and you can make lots of hay, then you have more food for your winter animals, so you can keep more animals through the winter. But also, if you can make your grass grow in the spring earlier, February, because again, we don't have fertilizers, they're colder winters, and the grass normally would only start growing kind of end of April, beginning of May. But if you've got grass, fresh grass growing in February and March, then you don't have to feed your animals as long, and you can keep bigger flocks of sheep. So he's talking about the early grass on the water meadows. He's also got a social conscience. He says that the water meadows are work for the industrious poor. Now, the water meadows are a lot of work. They're a lot of hard work. They're a lot of hand work. They need a lot of labour. And I'm sure that the trustees and the volunteers at Harnham Water Meadows Trust would agree that it's certainly work for the industrious poor. I'm sure Hadrian's listening in, and he might comment on that at the end. So where are they found? When we first started this work in the 1990s, looking at this, we mainly thought they were in Wessex. So that's Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, that kind of area. There's some in Sussex, there's some in Surrey. And that's the area I was looking at mainly. Some, of course, they're in Herefordshire, which is where Roland Vaughan said he started these water meadows. There's a couple in East Anglia, Castleacre Meadow in Norfolk, but there's not as many in East Anglia. It's a different kind of land. We went up to Nottingham. There's a lot of catchwork meadows in Nottingham, and we went up there, and there were some restored, but those are difficult to restore now because of the coal mining subsidence in Nottinghamshire. The land has changed, but there's still the structures and things up there. Staffordshire. If you drive up the M6 past Staffordshire, as you're going north on your left-hand side, on the west side, there's an area of peatland, and those were old water meadows. And I've been up there and talked to them. Exmoor. These are later water meadows. There was a gentleman called John Knight who bought Exmoor in about 1800. He did a lot of agricultural improvements there, and there's water there. They say there's water meadows in Scotland. With text to those, I haven't seen those. And actually, I've also been to see water meadows on the island of Jersey. So they're all over. In the past 10 years, we are actually talking to people on the continent. And on the continent, there are water meadows. I know there's some in France. There was actually a lady from Italy, Milan, came over because she has water meadows around there that she's helping with. And we went and we walked the water meadows at Salisbury, Harnham Water Meadows, and also in the Itchen Valley. And we were talking about the differences and how we manage them. But they're definitely water meadows that we're talking about. So they're all over Europe. So what was their importance in the 17th century? Because I said that I started really my studies 1610 when Roland Vaughan bought this book, because before that I can't read medieval Latin, and it's a bit like chasing will-o'-the-wisps trying to pin them down. Well, they're providing early grazing for the sheep. So the sheep are down on the water meadows grazing February, March, April, before the grass is growing elsewhere. So you can keep a large flock of sheep. And the sheep don't stay on the water meadows 24 hours a day. So the sheep are only on the water meadows during daylight hours, perhaps 10 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the shepherd will herd them back up to the land for staying dry at night, because sheep are very susceptible to diseases. And it's part of the sheep corn system. So what's the sheep corn system? So when the sheep were taken off the water meadows for the night, they were taken up onto the arable land, and we're talking spring crops. If you think about the land round the Itchen, round the Test, it's actually quite thin chalk soils. And if you want to grow arable crops, if you want to grow wheat and barley, then you need to fertilise them. So they were using the sheep to dung, and they would fold them on the arable land at night, and they would move the night fold every day. So the sheep would walk down to the water meadows in the morning, graze an area, walk up to the arable land at night, be up there, they'd dung and urine, fertilise the land. And then they would move the night fold, walk the sheep down to the water meadows, and then they'd dung and urine at another area the next night. And it was a fertiliser system. And there's a text that says 200 couples, and a couple is a ewe and a lamb, would graze an acre of water meadow during the day, and they could fertilise an acre of arable land at night, and that would increase the yield of the arable crops significantly. So we now got increased sheep flock. We've also got an increased grain harvest. It's talking about the reliable hay crops, and the hay crops are not only used to keep the animals during the winter, but you need hay to feed the horses. They didn't have tractors, they didn't have cars, so your means of transport is a horse. So you need hay for all your transport. So there's a lot going on these water meadows. The hay crop, I had a farmer in the Wey Valley tell me that it was actually difficult to make a hay crop on the water meadows because, as you can imagine, they're damp. You need the hay to dry out, and you turn it, you ted it before you bring it in. And he said that he put his hay crop up on poles to dry. And I didn't really compute this. I've never heard this tale anywhere else. And I actually went to the Faroes a few years ago, and all of a sudden it was a light bulb moment, because there in the Faroes, these are two pictures that I took, and you can see they've taken the hay crop and they put it up on the fence to dry so that they can dry that grass quickly to make hay for their winter fodder. So there they are, still practicing it in the Faroes. And since then, I have had other people tell me that in the north of England, they did that as well. This is the Drovers Hostel in Stockbridge on the River Test. And it was a way station for the drovers who were bringing animals from Wales to the markets, perhaps Southampton, Portsmouth, perhaps London. And still in Welsh, it says there, seasons hay and rich grass. So this is an area where you can rest up your animals and feed them up a little bit for a couple of days before you take them to the markets down in Southampton or Portsmouth. But it's also advertising good ale for the drovers. So they're going to have a good night there, and the animals are going to be looked after. So the hay is used for many different things. For the horses, for the transport system, for the drovers, when they're taking the cattle to market over long distances, but also the farmer's keeping it on his own land to feed his animals during the winter. This is the sheep corn system. So if you look at that, it's a circle, and it's supposed to represent 24 hours. So the sheep would be grazed on the water meadows during the day, between about 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. In the afternoon, they'd move those sheep up to the arable land, where they'd fold them for the night. Then the following morning, they'd move them back down to the meadows. There's a 3-field system going on here. So the water meadows, you're having a meadow being irrigated, and it's probably irrigated for, in January, a couple of weeks. Then it would be drained for a couple of weeks, and then it would be dry enough to put the animals on to feed it. And after you've fed the animals on your water meadow, you would irrigate that one again for a week or 2 weeks to help the grass to grow, and the sheep would go to another water meadow that was dried. So it wasn't continuous irrigation. It was irrigated for a week or 2 weeks in the winter. It might only be irrigated for overnight in the summer. And it's on rotation, and you're rotating the fields where your sheep are grazing, you're rotating the fields that are being irrigated, and you're rotating the areas of arable land where they're going to spend the night. And these are the sheep that would probably be used on the water meadows. They're the Wiltshire horn sheep, and they're very stocky, and they can walk quite a long way. But in 1800, actually the value in agriculture, the highest prices you get in agriculture, is for your wheat or your barley crop. And the texts in 1800 say that the sheep flock is in a terrible state because they're just being used as mobile wheelbarrows. And normally you would expect to get 2 lambs out of a ewe today. Then there was only 1 lamb, and only perhaps 1 lamb in every 2 would survive. And that's what they would be growing up on the arable land. This is long straw wheat. Today, our wheat varieties don't have that length of straw. This is taken up on Salisbury Plain. If you drive from Devizes to Upavon and on to Andover, then if you're going across that road at the right time of year, you will see the traditional straw being grown, the traditional wheat being grown, the long straw wheat, harvested in the traditional way, because the thatchers now use it for, so that's going to be used for thatch. But that's what they would have been growing upon the fields in 1800. This is another circle showing the year and showing what's happening in the year. And your inputs are water and labour. And the water has a liming effect and it has a manuring effect. And the products there, in the spring, you get early lambs and mutton. And also the sheep are taken up. So you're manuring the arable land, as I've said. You also get wool from your sheep. You might irrigate again. You would then take a hay crop and you would take a hay to be kept over the winter to allow you to have larger flocks of sheep, or you would take hay to sell. You might have 2 or 3 hay crops. You can see that they're irrigating, draining, and then the hay crop, irrigating, draining, hay crop. In the autumn, you might graze the cattle there and get milk and dairy products from it. And then in the autumn, you would use the first water of the rains of the autumn, which would bring all the silt down from the hills, from the fields, from the roads, to fertilise your land. You would repair them, you would irrigate them through November, and you would perhaps start irrigating again for 2 weeks at a time and draining December, January, and then you would start the 3 system of your field, irrigating, draining, and then grazing through to the end of April. At the end of April, there was grass available growing on other land, so they would take the sheep off the fields at the end of April, and as I say, shut them up for hay. The other thing that this did was sheep, if you leave them on wet land 24 hours a day, they get foot rot. So by taking them off the meadows at night, it reduces that problem. Also, there's a disease called liver fluke. And if you left the sheep on the meadows the whole year round, they would get this disease called liver fluke and they'd probably die. There is a text about 1800 saying that water meadows don't work in Kent. And I have seen some water meadows in Kent. I don't think it's that the water meadows didn't work in Kent. I think they got their sheep husbandry wrong, and the sheep flock sickened and died either because they were kept on the meadows too long and they got foot rot, or they got liver fluke. So there's lots of things going on here, and they didn't know why it worked. They just knew it worked. Hence the myth and the magic of the drowner. This is in the church wall at Great Wishford, and it's called the breadstones, and it's showing you the price of bread. And so in 1800, the price of bread was quite high. It was 3 shillings and 4 a gallon. And it stayed high until 1835, when they repealed the Corn Laws. And then it went down to 10 pence a gallon. So the price of bread significantly drops. So the price of wheat significantly drops in the late 1800s. It went up again to 2 shillings and 8 pence in the 1920s. During the Second World War, the government subsidised the price of bread, so it was only 1 shilling and 7 pence. In 1965, it was 5 shillings and 4 pence a gallon. A gallon's quite a big unit of bread. And in 2000, they added a new one saying it was £3.72 new pence a gallon. So that shows you the price of bread and the price of wheat through the ages from 1800 to 2000. So the prices of agricultural products are going up and down for various reasons. I talked about the irrigation deed at St Cross. There's also an irrigation deed at Peter's Finger Farm, which is just south of Salisbury. Again, 2 farmers. They had to pay the miller for the water with £45 a year. And it also has a map, and it shows in great detail who is getting the water when, which farmer can irrigate on what days, and also who's got to mend which sluices. I was talking to a lady in the Wey Valley, and she was the family had owned the mill, and they were Methodists. And she said that the mill worked from Monday morning through to Saturday night. So the mill wanted all the water. It was actually producing paper for banknotes. And the farmer could only have the water on a Sunday. Because they were Methodists, the mill stopped working Saturday evening, so the farmer could irrigate his meadows Saturday evening and Sunday, and then the mill wanted the water again on the Monday morning. So depending on the economics of the mill or the meadows and where you were and the availability of water, there was lots of different arrangements about water. And as I say, if anybody knows of any more irrigation deeds, please do let me know. They're fascinating. We get to 1851, and there's another book written by a gentleman called Stevens. If any of you watched the Edwardian Farm on television, this was the book they kept referring to. I have a friend of a farmer who lent me this, and they talk about all kinds of things on the farm, but they also talk about irrigation on the farm and the water meadows. And it's in this book, actually, they detail some water meadows in Scotland, which I need to go and find. Oh, this is what they said were happening in Scotland. You can see there, they're irrigating and draining. They're actually only grazing with cattle. They're taking 2 or 3 hay cuts. I think there's 4 hay cuts there. They're grazing with cattle in the autumn. And I don't think they have, oh yes, they have sheep on the meadows for a short time in the spring. So it's a slightly different system that they're using in Scotland, different conditions, different economics. But as I said, end of the 1800s, changing agricultural systems. We have the British Empire, Victoria's on the throne, and we get inputs of wool and mutton from Australia and New Zealand. So the price of mutton and wool dives, and the farmers aren't making a lot of money out of sheep. Cereals and beef are imported from the Americas. So again, the price of cereals, wheat, barley and beef, that takes a nosedive well again. And artificial fertilizers are beginning to come in. It's actually guarana is being brought in and on the field. So all the products of water meadows, they're not as economic as they used to be. And then in the 1880s, there's a series of very bad summers. We've had a bad summer this summer with a lot of rain. It's been difficult for the farmers to harvest the wheat. It was very wet during the winter, so the sheep sickened and died. And a lot of the farmers went bust, or they had to change their systems. There's a very good book written, it's a novel by a gentleman called Arthur Street, and he's called Farmer's Glory. And he, if you like, details this time from about 1900 through the First World War. What's happening on the farm? It's a biography about farm in the Wiley Valley. So if you're interested, that's a very good read. Punch made fun of it, that they were able to hide under their umbrellas. They weren't getting any work done, but it was really bad news for the farmers. So what happened? Was it the death knell for the water meadows? Not really, because with the Victorians came the Industrial Revolution, there came the transport. So they turned to dairying. They were no longer putting sheep on the meadows. Sheep might have been on the higher ground. They might still be staking a hay crop, but they were putting cattle on the meadows. They were small family-run farmers, and they were single enterprises, but they could get their fresh milk to the towns on the railways. I interviewed a gentleman down at Ringwood, and he was a young boy in the 1920s. Now, he was too small to actually hold a milk churn. These were bigger than the milk churns that you might remember from the 1960s. And the empty milk churns would come back on the train, and they would need empty milk churns to put their milk in to send back up to London. So his dad, in the spring, wanted as many milk churns as he could. And this young boy, he couldn't move the milk churns, but his dad said, go and get the tops of the milk churns, the lids. So he would run down the platform, taking as many milk churn lids as he could, because the milk churn was useless without a lid, and then his dad would come and pick up all the milk churns that he needed for his cattle. Because when they put the cattle out in the spring, in March, onto the meadows, the milk yield increased incredibly. And of course, that was early milk, the price was good, and if they needed to get it to the markets in Southampton, in Salisbury, in London, in Guildford. And this is kind of what they were doing. This is what Arthur Street says they were doing in the 1930s on the water meadows in the Wylye Valley. They were only irrigating in the winter. They didn't have sheep on the meadows, and he says that he wasn't taking a corn crop, a hay crop. He was only grazing cattle on the meadows from April to the end of October. Again, we have the inputs, it's labour and water, and the water's bringing, fertilising them and liming them. But we only have milk or perhaps beef or veal as an output. So it reduces the input. So the farmers, although they have, if you like, a weekly milk check or a monthly milk check, they're very dependent on the price of milk. So when the price of milk went down in the 60s, many of the farmers in the Avon Valley, if they hadn't stopped irrigating water meadows before, they stopped putting their cattle on the water meadows for milk, and the water meadows started to slowly become derelict from the end of the First War. After the First World War, there was a shortage of labour, not just because of the huge loss of death in the trenches, but also there was the Spanish flu, which decimated the population at home. So the price of agricultural labour increased. Difficult to operate. We get tractors coming in during the Second World War. These are soft, squidgy soils, so it's difficult to mechanise them. It's all handwork. Changing social perceptions. The gentleman that I talked to at Ringwood in the Avon Valley, he talked to me about an hour, and he would say, young lads these days, they don't want to be out on the farm. They want to be playing on their Xboxes. They don't want to be going out all weathers. And he talked like this for an hour. And when I got home, I listened to the tape again. And I realised what he was actually saying was, in the 1920s, me and my brother, we didn't want to go out in bad weather. We wanted to play with a new tractor. So there's changing social perceptions. You don't want to be out in bad weather, changing sluices. And then the Second World War came along. And I don't know if you know about the stop lines. You've probably seen old concrete pillboxes, and there's certainly a line along the Kennerton-Avon Canal. And this was a line of defence that the Ministry of War put in case the Germans invaded Britain. So there was pillboxes all along the Avon Canal so they could shoot at the Germans that were invading. They took out weirs and they changed the water flows in the Wylye Valley. So it would be really difficult to irrigate some of the meadows in the Wylye Valley now, because they changed it during the Second World War to deepen the river in places so tanks couldn't cross. And that really was one of the death knells of the water meadows. And as I say, then in the 1960s, the price of milk went down. And again, the farmers, it wasn't economic to use the water meadows for their dairy farms. So why are they important today? Well, I think this picture sums it up. This is Constable painting Salisbury Cathedral, and we have the Harnham water meadows with the cattle grazing on them in the foreground. They're part of our cultural heritage. They're part of the landscape. We love walking the long distance footpaths along. People come and paint this, or they walk along the rivers. They're a haven for wildlife. We were restoring the water meadows, or the ditches of the water meadows rather, in the lower Itchen Valley, or the back streams for the southern damselfly. This is a very rare damselfly. We have 25% of the world population in the lower Itchen Valley. So we were trying to restore the backwaters to encourage this insect to extend its range, shall we say. But otters, water voles, all the wand and dragonflies, the flora and fauna is great. The flora, there's one water meadow in the Avon Valley. I went out one May. It wasn't irrigated, it was dry, but the furrows were wet and there was water avens growing in the furrows, and then there was cowslips on the dry top of the ridges. So there's a huge diversity of flora on these meadows. And then, of course, the mammals, the water voles and the otters, they use these channels as well. So they're incredibly important for our wildlife, for our birds, and for our social well-being. This is a wonderful picture. I was out, it's near Alresford, it's on the Candover Valley. I was actually out there doing some work for the Watercress and Winterbournes project. Beautiful day, steam rising off the frozen. And along one side, there's a medieval trackway with some ancient trees. Just beyond the picture, there's some ancient parkland. They use it for recreation, for fishing, for wildfowling. And actually, historically, this was a medieval fish pond used by the bishops of Winchester. So there's a lot of history there in our valleys if you can just stop and stare. So we ought to all do what the poem tells us to do. What is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. So I encourage you all to go out onto the water meadows and just stand and stare at the landscape and what you can see around you. The trees are important. The one on the right is a very old pollarded alder. They talk about the history and how the valleys have been used historically. On the left, it's a poplar plantation. In the early 1900s, Bryant and May, the matchstick people, these poplars were grown by farmers under contract. People stopped using matchsticks, lighters came in, and they were never harvested for Bryant and May. So they're still there in some places, coming to the end of their life now. They're part of the social history. This is a forge, a working forge. It's been working for probably 400 years. There's still a blacksmith in there today. And he would have not only shoed the horses and perhaps the oxen, but he also made structures for the water meadows. And if you walk down the water meadows, you can see lots of interesting structures. These are actually late 1800 structures. The one on the left is at Beer Mill and was made by Taskers Vandover. Often they will stamped with the date and the foundry. The one on the right is near Winchester, and it was made by the Dewson's Foundry in Winchester. So there's lots of different types of history on the water meadows. And of course, the drowners. We're becoming a very rare breed. One of my claims to fame is I think that I'm the only lady drowner. And I actually think there's only about a dozen drowners in the whole country. So you have myself and Hadrian at Harnham Water Meadows on the left, and then Roger and Chris at Itchenstoke on the right. So if anybody wants to learn how to work a water meadow, talk to Harnham Water Meadows, and there's other people who are managing their water meadows who would welcome volunteers. But we're in autumn, and they are part of, if you like, our country idyll, aren't the water meadows? This is John Keats, one of my favourite poems, and he was looking over the River Itchen. This is the River Itchen looking south from St Cross Mill. And in 1890, he talked of the seasons of mist and mellow fruitfulness as he looked across the water meadows at Winchester. Also, as a last thing, I am trying to write all this down. I am trying to put it in a book. I'm about 80% there, and hopefully within the next 12 months, I will be publishing a book which will tell you everything that I've told tonight, plus a lot more stories that I've had from the farmers and things that I've found about the water meadows. So I'm happy to take questions if anybody's got any burning desire to ask me anything.